Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this lecture series on lessons not learned from the Holocaust. My name is Mika Ahuvia, and I'm the Marcia and Jay Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies here at the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. As Curriculum Chair of Jewish Studies, I'll be facilitating this series of events, which is also a 2-credit hour course here at UW. Okay. I'd now like to introduce Professor Lila Fernandez, the Stanley D. Golub Chair of International Studies. Dr. Fernandez assumed her duties as director of the Stroum Center's home department, the Jackson School, here in July. We are so glad to have her here to introduce the evening for her first ever Stroum Center for Jewish Studies event. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fernandez.
Thank you so much, Mika, for your kind introduction and for all that you do for the Stroum Center and for the Jackson School and for the university. You are truly wonderful, and I've also been learning a lot about your work this past couple of weeks, and I'm just so happy to have you as a colleague. I also want to thank you for facilitating this public event, Lessons Not Learned from the Holocaust. As you mentioned, this is my first public event for the whole school, and actually, I guess, for the University of Washington. And I cannot think of a more important event with which to begin my term, especially given the context in which we are living in the United States and globally. I would especially like to thank Steven Baral for his visionary leadership in supporting this program. Without his support, Lessons Not Learned would not have been possible. Thank you, Steven, for all that you're doing to ensure that this history continues to be studied, and that we keep asking ourselves if we have in fact learned these lessons and how we can do better in learning them. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Daniel Shiro, the Herbert Ellison Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies at the University of Washington's Jackson School. Professor Shiro has authored several critically acclaimed books about social change, ethnic and nationalist conflicts, Eastern Europe and tyranny, including Why Not Kill Them All, and is a co-author of The Shape of the New, 4 Big Ideas and How They Made the Modern World, which is coming out with Princeton University. This book is about the old and continuing struggle between liberating Enlightenment ideals, their opponents, and how this conflict of ideas has shaped our current global political environment. He has edited or co-edited many books on Leninism's decline, on entrepreneurial ethnic minorities, on ethno-political warfare, on the economic history of Eastern Europe, and on memories of World War II. He teaches courses on these same topics and on American security policies here at the Jackson School. Professor Shiro also founded the journal East European Politics and Societies, and he has received fellowships and recognition from, among others, the Guggenheim, Rockefeller, and Mellon Foundations, and from the US State Department. He has consulted for the US government, the Ford Foundation, CARE, and other NGOs in Eastern Europe and West Africa. As you can see from his record, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, it's an honor to have Daniel Shiro as my colleague, and I'm now going to turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I'm really happy to introduce Jan Gross, an old friend. We've known each other for a long time. The first book that I read by Jan, I think was his first book. It was called Polish Society Under German Occupation. And I thought I knew a lot about World War II and what had happened, but I remember that book was a great enlightenment for me about the reality of what really happened during the occupation and why Poles turned so strongly against that occupation, because in a sense they had no choice. The next book of his that I read was called Revolution from Abroad, Soviet Conquest of Eastern Poland. And it was another shattering book about how terrible the Soviet occupation was of the eastern part of Poland between 1939 and 1941, a period and an area that really hadn't been studied very much because it wasn't exactly World War II. It was before the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. But the Germans and the Soviets had come to an agreement about how to split up Poland, and what is now Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia were part of Poland at that time, and the Soviet occupation was a nightmare. It was terrible. Lots of people were killed. The most famous, of course, episode was the massacre in Katyn. But what Jan did was to look at what actually happened to a lot of ordinary people and their children, people who were killed, people who were separated, people who were sent off to Siberia. His most famous book, which I think many of us have read, was Neighbors, and he's going to talk about that tonight, about Polish anti-Semitism and how many Jews were killed actually by Poles themselves, and not necessarily because of German orders, but because the Germans, of course, tolerated that. And it brought out this latent, well, not so latent, but this strong anti-Semitism, and resulted in more massacres. In a way, perhaps an even more controversial book was his book called Fear, which is about Jews who were killed coming back after the war, who were killed by Poles who had taken over their property, who didn't want them back. And it has to be pointed out that after the fall of communism in Poland, and during a period when there was considerable hope that Poland would turn into a democratic and liberal society, Jan was greatly honored in Poland and respected. His work was recognized, and he was a kind of really of an academic hero. Unfortunately, as those of us who follow Eastern European politics know, that hasn't continued. And since the arrival of right-wing nationalist government in more than nationalist, but xenophobic government in Poland that denies that the Poles were anything other than victims. Of course, they were victims. It wasn't just the Jews there. But the official line in Poland is that Poles never did anything wrong. They were just victimized. And Jan has become, tell me if I'm wrong, Jan, one of the favorite academic enemies of the regime in Poland today. And that's a sad statement about what's going on in Poland. Perhaps an even more devastating book, which is more recent, that he did with Irena Gross and was published in 2012, is called Golden Harvest. And I'll just say a few words about that. It's actually a devastating book. It starts with a picture of peasants who look happy. They've been just digging up stuff. It looks like if they're digging up a field. And then when you look more closely, there's a lot of bones and skulls there. And what it is Poland is peasants near a death camp after the war, digging up skeletons, looking for gold that the Germans, it's known that the Germans in the concentration camps would steal gold out of fillings and anything they could find on their victims. And these peasants were digging up fields of just mass burials, looking for possibly any gold that the Germans had missed. And that says a lot about the whole story. I have huge respect for Jan, but I have to say none of his books are terribly cheerful. And in a way, this is sort of a culmination of all the horrors. And he's going to be talking about that tonight. And I really appreciate it. And thank you very much, Jan. And I'm sure that everyone will be very enlightened by what you have to say.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation to appear at the University of Washington. It gives me a great pleasure to join you again, even though I cannot do so in person. I apologize, but the times are such that we have to use virtual methods of communication to talk to one another. I'm going to speak today about the subject of the Holocaust and the difficulty of confronting it. Let me start with a few very simple and basic facts as a preliminary. We just have to put the whole story in a quick context, if you will. The Second World War was the most calamitous and brutal war experience that humanity has produced and suffered. In the course of war activities, some 55, we don't know exactly the number, million people had died directly as being killed. And altogether, if you include also people who have died of starvation and disease that accompanied these horrible events over the course of 5 years, then you should add another 20 million or so. Out of those who have been killed directly, about 2/3 were civilians. If you come to think about it, this is an extraordinary and terrifying aspect of this conflict. It's not just the combatants who are involved in direct warfare, so to speak, who have been killing each other. Civilian population has been targeted and has succumbed to violence in proportions that were just extraordinarily high. It just, in that respect alone, this Second World War resembles very much something a kind of conflict that might be rather called a civil war. So this is the context in which we can start thinking and conceptualizing finally what Holocaust was all about. This genocide of European Jewry. 6 million civilians killed in a deliberate process, not, as one would put it using military parlance, as collateral damage, but as a target of very deliberate policy which was to kill the entire Jewish population of Europe. This was a policy that Nazi Germany pursued in the context of the Second World War after it had occupied a huge swath of European continent, most of it, in fact. The results, as we know, and the whole phenomenon today for us is a moment of just a profound crisis of the Western civilization, if you will. We think and conceive of the Holocaust as a truly key phenomenon of the Second World War and of the 20th century. But immediately after the war, the situation was not so. There was very little curiosity and willingness to confront this issue. To be fair, Europe was in a state of profound turmoil, and as a result of these catastrophic material and human losses all around. And this was a time also of profound rearrangements as far as geopolitics of the world were concerned. New European order, geopolitical order in fact, was being constructed after the war, with suddenly the Soviet Union playing a completely novel role in the arrangements of world powers. Half of Europe, the countries that find themselves in Eastern Europe that were liberated by the Red Army, found themselves in a situation where new regimes were being imposed there, regimes in which communist parties were playing the leading role. And in fact, for the next 40 years or so, Eastern Europe would become part of the Soviet bloc and would be locked in that pattern of politics that was created as a result of the Second World War. There were also very profound and difficult processes that had to play out in Western Europe, where the strength of communist parties, for example, grew dramatically, and there was de facto a fear that the rest of the continent as well might succumb to Soviet rule and Communist Party domination. The Marshall Plan, as you know, was a device that Western powers came up with in order to prevent this outcome. In every country, there was an issue of dealing with what has happened exactly a few years before, throughout, in other words, during the occupation, and there were collaborationist governments and regimes that had to be taken into account, and as it were, histories of this period created for public consumption in such a way that they could serve as legitimating narratives for construction of post-war regimes. Germany, a central state in Europe as to its location and significance, was just completely in shatters. So there were lots of problems, as it were, to confront. But the fact remains, and I think we may look at it with somewhat puzzled today, from today's perspective, that Holocaust was really out of the picture and the fate that befell on Jews as a subject matter of reflection and somehow consideration for what it taught us about wartime experience and the solidity of European political regimes. Except, of course, for the Jews themselves, the remnants of the Jews who survived the war. In Poland, this was truly, I mentioned Poland because I'll be talking to you about an episode that took place in the town of Jedwabne later on, about which I've written a book. But what's very important in a sense of general history of the Holocaust, the Polish experiences are absolutely central, with just half of all the victims of the genocide of European Jews were Polish Jews. 3 million victims out of 6 million total that were killed in the process were citizens of Poland before the war. So in Poland, the Holocaust was extraordinarily devastating. Of all of the Jews that remained in the territories that were occupied by the Germans, about 1 to 2% only survived. The fact that 10% of Polish Jewry survived the war had to do with just circumstantial episodes, namely that the Jews found themselves far east, as it were, during the early stage of the war, and when later on part of them were deported to the Soviet interior, where most of them survived or were able to flee from the advancing German armies. In any case, the devastation, of course, was terrifying. But the remnants of Jewry, whether in Poland or in other countries where slightly larger percentages of Jews, pre-war Jewish population survived, there was, of course, a very dramatic sense of the urgency to record and preserve evidence of this unprecedented, completely transformative, if you will, in the history of the Jews in particular, historical moment that Holocaust produced. And it worked differently in different places, but usually there will be a group of historians or of concerned social activists who would form committees, historical commissions, that would try to get people to leave testimonies of their experiences. And we have thousands and thousands of documents that have been assembled during that time, immediately after the war, by Jewish survivors, essentially, those who have experienced the whole impact of German policies and lived under the German occupation, and just by a fluke survived, unlike the vast majority of their fellow citizens. But these testimonies, this testimonial evidence, for a long time, decades in fact, would be viewed by historians who would stumble upon it as unreliable, essentially as very personal, if you wish, and provided by people who are experiencing a trauma after traumatic episodes that they went through, and just as a result of it, unreliable, if you will. And the historiography of the Holocaust, as it will be constructed early on, will essentially dwell on evidence provided by German documents primarily. But even so, the curiosity about it was very limited. Let me give you, as an example, the story of the doyen of Holocaust historians, named Raoul Hilberg, who, as a young man before the war, escaped from Austria to the United States and survived. And got interested already during the war when he went to college in the fate of Jews in Europe. At the time, scraps of information were coming through, and they were being reported in the newspapers occasionally. Of course, already the public knew something about extreme hardship to which Jews were exposed, but nobody had an idea of the reality, as it were, of this whole process of destruction that was going on in a very deliberate fashion in Europe at the time. And after the war, Hilberg decided to pursue his interests and went to Columbia University, where he enrolled in a doctoral program in political science and decided to write a dissertation on the subject of the destruction of European Jews. That would be the title of his magisterial work that he would be later on working on for the rest of his life, really producing updates and new editions of the book after it came out. But at the time when he started working as a graduate student, his advisor, who was very sympathetic, he was also an exiled Austrian Jew, his name was Franz Neumann, somebody also who was professionally very interested in the workings of Nazi state. He wrote a very important book that came out in 1942, very early, while the war was still going on, analyzing the workings of this totalitarian regime. In any case, Neumann told him, "Of course, you can do it. I'll take you as an advisee, but you must be aware of the fact that you won't be able to find an academic position. Nobody is really interested in the subject." And indeed, Hilberg completed his dissertation in 1955, and it took him about 6 years to get it published. A dissertation that received an award at Columbia University as the best dissertation in the field of social sciences, I believe, and would later be recognized after the book gets published and republished many times as really a foundation piece of research in Holocaust studies, there was very little interest in it initially. Hilbeck, in his work, set up a kind of a main paradigm that functioned for a number of years, if you will. He was curious, and then I think it was a completely legitimate curiosity, of course, to reconstruct how the whole organization and a bureaucratic framework of this unprecedented endeavor in which a modern state would undertake a program of organizing killing on an industrial scale, if you will, to get rid and destroy a population that was spread out all over the European continent, and that in the Nazi endeavor would be brought to these killing centers where extermination camps, where Jews were primarily gassed and killed in gas chambers, and later on, also part of the process would have to do with cremation of the bodies, disposal of evidence, etc., etc. So as a result, in Hilbeck's analysis, in the framing that he posited, there were two protagonists in the genocide that confronted one another, namely Jews and Germans. And of course, this was true as far as it goes. But with time passing and people starting to think more and more about and write about the issue, it became clear that this is not a sufficient context. This is not a sufficient plane of analysis, that there is something more that needs to be brought in, namely the relationship between Jews and local European societies from which they had to be extracted by the Nazi occupational administration in order to be killed in these extermination camps. And slowly this was emerging as an issue that needs to be brought into focus. And so in 1992, Hilbeck publishes a book under the title of Perpetrators, Victims, and Bystanders. It's a curious book. It has gained enormous influence in Holocaust studies because of one word included in the title, that third term, bystanders, which was a revision, as it were, on his main framework from that fundamental piece of research that I have described to you, where essentially there were two protagonists in the conceptualization of the process of the Holocaust, Germans and the Jews. Now there was a third protagonist. I think the content of the book does not measure up to the significance of and importance, it seems to me, of the breakthrough that the introduction of the third term accomplished. And perhaps the success of the term also had to do with the fact that the word bystander conveys a kind of a sense of innocuous presence, but nevertheless it tapped this growing awareness that there is more to the story than merely describing the relationship between Germans and Jews. That there is a third term in it, and that's the local population. And while Hilbeck's term, bystanders, essentially diffused, if you will, the urgency and the drama of that the actions and the activities of the local population will insert into the whole process. Nevertheless, it kind of put us on and scholars on the path of considering it. And once we started, we Holocaust scholars, thinking about this third term, as it were, it turned out that bystanders were not so innocent and innocuous as the term itself might suggest. But as I said, as an introduction of the issue, it may have been a very, and was a very important opening. Around the same time, more or less, a French priest by the name of Patrick Dubois started documenting sites of mass murder of Jews in the East, in Ukraine primarily. He realized that there were multiple sites of this sort and they haven't been in any way recognized or protected, and just for a priest, it called him to action, so to speak. And he started going then with a keep of helpers. Since he was a priest, the local people were more willing to talk with him than they would have been otherwise, I presume. Well, what this led to was the discovery. Discovery is perhaps too big a word again, because we scholars knew about these mass killings inside rather than in extermination camps, as was the main form of killing of the Jews that the Germans have resorted to. Killings in the field, as it were, that were taking place, especially in the East. After the war between Germany and the Soviet Union started in June of 1941, later on there will be a spate of these killings that will take place. Incidentally, it is the beginning of the war between the Soviet Union and Germany that really marks the beginning of the Holocaust as we know it. In other words, the beginning of mass killings of Jews. Well, in any case, Dubois started documenting these sites, and he would come up with a very felicitous, once again, term to describe what has happened, something that got people's attention and is part of the vocabulary now. And just like bystanders became part of the vocabulary of Holocaust studies. The term that Patrick Dubois coined was Holocaust by bullets. It's very important as a distinction between what essentially Hilberg in his original work was involved with, and as an addition to our understanding, that fundamental understanding of how the Holocaust has been carried out, essentially in extermination camps, with the use of gas chambers, and then later crematoria, to dispose of bodies that had been killed by asphyxiation, essentially. Now, it turns out that out of 6 million Jews that had been killed during the Holocaust, that had lost their lives, I would say anywhere between 1 and 1.5 million, perhaps even more, had not been killed in gas chambers. They have been killed in the site in which they lived or nearby by the use of either bullets or, as the episode that I'm going to finally briefly mention to you, this killing Jews in the little town of Jedwabne, by other means, by very primitive means, by, for example, burning people in a barn, as it has happened in Jedwabne and in many other places, or killings that were carried out by the local population. The Holocaust by bullets were a process where firearms are used, of course. But what's very important to know is that in those killing squads that would carry out actually the murder, quite often the majority of the people who were firing their weapons were members locally recruited of some auxiliary police forces or just battalions that have been used by the Germans in order to maintain order in this area, or in effect, much of their activity consisted in being used as firing squads and for killing local Jews. So this is the story of the Holocaust suddenly gets much more complicated. We recognize that the involvement of the local population in a variety of ways, and it had a different modality in different parts of occupied Europe because of the circumstances and what Germans were interested in, so to speak, getting out of the local people, and opportunities that they created for local engagement. It turns out that there was a very considerable degree of complicity of the local population. The facts of this are very well documented, of course, in the individual testimonies that have been collected from Jews immediately after the war by other Jews who had survived. So suddenly historians also turned their attention to this new, not so new in fact, very old trove of evidence that for a long time was left neglected, essentially, because it was deemed to be of limited value. And it's, in fact, invaluable. That is, we would know nothing about a myriad of episodes unless we reached and could draw and tap into this extremely rich source of information. So let me tell you a few things about the story of the Jedwabne murder. It was perpetrated in a little village called Jedwabne on local Jews by their fellow citizens, fellow inhabitants of the very same village, who almost entirely were Poles of Roman Catholic Poles. I say Roman Catholic Poles because this is a fairly unusual circumstance. In the in this phase of the war, immediately after the Soviet-German war started in June of 1941, we witness a whole series of mass murders of the Jewish population perpetrated along, if you will, the border from south to north of what used to be the boundary of the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. And it usually involved a kind of an ethnic mix of populations. There were Belarusians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, a kind of a circumstance in which you would find basically a purely Polish population ethnically involved is what was not very common and was not just we didn't know very much about such circumstances. Now, what happened there was just unambiguous, if you will. It takes place shortly after the outbreak of this Soviet-German war, in the context of immediate and just extraordinary violence that the German troops and police units that come just behind the front troops, so-called Einsatzgruppen, mete out to the Jews. Mass killings taking place right away, immediately after these hostilities start. So the war starts on June 22nd, 1941. The little town of Jedwabne is reached very quickly, within a few days, 2 or 3 days, and on July 10th, this murder takes place. There had been several other mass murders of Jews in the vicinity, in the same area. It's in some way we may think about it as a kind of a copycat murder. A few days earlier, on July 7th, in the little town of Radziłów, the Jewish community had been wiped out by its neighbors, essentially. A few days prior to that, in a smaller town of Wąsor, also a murder of this sort has taken place. What was characteristic of these episodes was that the German army has already moved on. The German presence locally was just minimal, essentially. And that the murder had been carried out by the locals. At the instigation, of course, of the Germans, if only because people could see that it can be done, since Jews were killed all around in various places. But in the end, the initiative was local, and while some Germans were present there, they gave permission, they didn't participate in it actively, they just observed it. And this was just an extraordinarily violent episode. We don't know the numbers exactly, but in the town of Jedwabne it was some 1,500 or 1,600 people who had been killed, most of them burned at the end of the day in a barn, but it was preceded by a whole day of persecution and killings, more individual killings, if you will. And it got very well documented, not only in the testimonies of Jews who had somehow survived and witnessed what has happened. This was the testimony that triggered the investigation of this matter. But in testimonies that have been later on given by participants in this murder, because after the war, this particular murder was tried in a court, if you will. In 1949, after the war, and then also in 1953, the main trial took place in 1949. Some 22 people were put on trial for participation in this murder. More or less half of them have been sentenced to various sentences, and they gave testimony. And this is another treasure trove of evidence that we have discovered in the last 20 years or so that amplifies our knowledge of what has happened during the Holocaust. These were post-war trials that were conducted in Poland primarily, but there is also some body of evidence from trials that were held in the Soviet Union, where essentially the testimonies are delivered not by Jews, but the local people who are involved in these killings. And by a fluke, for certain reasons, again, I don't want to go into it, it's too much, the most of these trials were conducted from a few paragraphs of the criminal code, and all of the dossiers of those trials were assembled after the war in a central archive, so historians now can have a very easy access. Concerning the Jedwabne murder, I would say, and the book, I've written the book on it called Neighbors, and this really triggered a whole series of events, if you will, leading to a ceremony where the president of the Polish Republic at the time, of Poland, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, appeared at the 60th anniversary of the murder in 2001, at the site of the murder where a new monument had been placed, replacing the old commemoration that was there, which attributed the murder to the Germans, falsely. Local population knew about it very well, always. And it generated an enormous debate in Poland concerning what has happened in Jedwabne and the implications of it and just the significance. It's understandable, of course, why this would be such a controversial issue, and I think in part we find here an explanation why for so long the issue of complicity of the local population had suppressed, if you will, the curiosity and the interest of within academias as well as general public in the countries involved, suppressed interest in the Holocaust. Because complicity, of course, in these horrendous crimes of some people with whom we find ourselves in a kind of a sense of identity as Poles or Ukrainians or French, if you will. There were other forms of complicity in France. It was the French collaborating administration which made big strides and contributed in identifying and rounding up and then sending Jews to extermination camps in Germany or in Hungary, for example. But the sense, the fact of complicity is very difficult to recognize, of course, in collective memory of a given community, because it implicates our forefathers in this extraordinarily dramatic and brutal undertaking. And what followed the publication of this book and was, as I said, just this widespread debate and discussion that engaged not only scholars, but a lot of public figures and journalists and in all kinds of media. And from the point of view of academia, it also resulted in something extraordinary, important, namely, it really launched curiosity and ample work in the field of the Holocaust, but particularly in the field of relationships between the local population and a non-Jewish population and the local Jewish population during the war and occupation in Poland. And by now, there is a center of studies of Holocaust in Poland at the Polish Academy of Sciences, for example, which has really developed an enormous bibliography by now of works dedicated to this study and to this issue. They have a yearbook which they publish regularly, thick, 800 to 1,000 each year of studies. By now there is already 15th volume, I think, that came out. And also an interest in much more general sense. There were artists, films were being made, theater pieces written, and so forth. And for a while it seemed like it's going to completely transform the understanding of Holocaust and the relationship between Holocaust and, as it were, mainstream Polish history, that the story of what has happened to Polish Jews at the hands of Polish citizens as well will enter the mainstream of historical narrative about the Second World War. It didn't happen. After a few years of these incredibly interesting debates and discussions, there were always enclaves of individuals and milieux, social milieux, that were extremely resistant to pick up the issue, and they're always claiming that this is really a contrived and falsified narrative. The pushback became really the dominant feature of on the intellectual landscape, if you will, and on the political landscape. And with the coming to power in the last 5 years ago of a very nationalistic and right-wing government, the whole effort of the state was dedicated to falsification, in fact, of wartime history and suppression of this knowledge. It's not going to work in the long time, of course, but too much has been written already. I'll show you a few illustrations of just the thickness of volumes that got published on the issue. So I'm hopeful, but it's part of the story, really, of why it's so difficult to come to terms with the Holocaust. And I would like to end my lecture today with a quote from a magisterial study of the Holocaust by Saul Friedlander. And in the concluding chapters of his second volume of The Years of Extermination, Nazi Germany and the Jews, he had written the following. And I'm quoting him. Not one social group, not one religious community, not one scholarly institution or professional association in Germany and throughout Europe declared its solidarity with the Jews. Some of the Christian churches declared that converted Jews were part of the flock up to a point. To the contrary, Many social constituencies, many power groups were directly involved in the expropriation of the Jews and eager, be it out of greed, for their wholesale disappearance. Thus, and this last sentence is underlined by the author, by Friedlander, Nazi and related anti-Jewish policies could unfold to their most extreme levels without the interference of any major countervailing interests. Unquote. This was a very mild way of framing the issue, especially in Eastern Europe. The involvement of the local population was very much more direct and lethal, in fact. Large segments of the population were involved in tracking down, denouncing, and very often, as we can see in the case of Jedwabne, with killing of their Jewish fellow citizens. Thank you very much.
So we will begin the Q&A. Thank you for this profound lecture. Students in this class had many questions. I'll just summarize two main themes. One was they were very curious about when historians, like what precipitated the change in making historians interested in the evidence of Jews that experienced the war. This might be more of a question for American historians, so no pressure to answer it. But the other question that several students raised is actually matched by the first question here in the Q&A from Elizabeth Sharp. They were interested in the demography, the demographics of the bystanders. Who were these people exactly? Can you say a little bit more that might help audience members and students understand why they chose to be active perpetrators? And remember to unmute yourself.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for just giving me this opportunity once again to address the issue and to interact with the audience at the University of Washington. Good questions. I don't really know when exactly the recognition seeps into the work, generally speaking, of Holocaust historians, the recognition that testimonies are such an important part of our empirical basis, so to speak, on which to work. The sense, the sort of subjectivity of personal narratives is that the historian must be very careful, has been always part of historical craft, so to speak. But it's a different story as far as the Holocaust is concerned, and in part because there is no other so dense and comprehensive body of empirical knowledge that has been assembled anywhere else on the process of the Holocaust. You know, the Nazis were quite reluctant to publicize what they were doing. They developed a kind of a language of obfuscation in their own internal reports about what was going on. So what we usually do, the sort of institutional documentation of activities, it's very deceptive, really, to rely on it when this catastrophe is the focus of our study. On the other hand, one must say that there was always, since many people have published books of personal recollections, memoirs, diaries, and so forth. I mean, just to begin with, the diary of Anne Frank, for instance, is such a iconic reference point to the just general and scholarly, if you will, knowledge about what Holocaust is all about. So, in a sense, you might say that in the very eye of Holocaust awareness, there is this individual testimony through which we see so much. But it really seeps in a big way into historical studies. I'd say the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century. Friedlander's work, I think it was published in 2007, if I'm not mistaken, the second volume, the one that deals with the Holocaust itself. And he speaks there kind of openly, without personal testimonies factored in. You can't get a grasp on what has happened. The local population that gets involved, well, you know, it depends on the place, but in countries east of Germany, it's a very important distinction in terms of the unfolding of the whole process of genocide of the Jews. Germans would lead a kind of an unrestricted war in the East, also in part because of this racial philosophy that Nazism espoused, of the hierarchy of worthiness of human beings. But just as Jews were at the very bottom of that scale, unworthy of, as it turned out in the end, in their Nazi practice of being left alive, the populations that lived in Europe to the east of Germany, the Slavic people, were viewed by them as also as sort of lesser than fully human, sort of Untermenschen. And when Hitler began his war with the Soviet Union, he openly spoke to his own armies and military that this is a war of extermination. Essentially, you don't have the laws of war are not you don't have to obey it. So this is also an area where the vast majority of European Jewry lives. You know, in Poland alone, half of all European of Jews killed in the Holocaust live. But this is after the United States, where over a period of time, Polish Jews had emigrated and they constituted the larger part of the population. And then if you look even further in Ukraine and Belarus, that's where the bulk of Jewry that gets killed in the Holocaust lives. So the engagement of the local population, they live face to face with Jews in thousands of communities. East European Jews are also socially different than West European Jews in the way they are less assimilated, they are very poor, unlike these highly assimilated and middle class, if you wish, Jewries of of Holland or Germany itself. So you have when the Nazi occupation comes and the Jews in Eastern Europe are subjected to persecution and to various policies that precede extermination. The local people over there are witnessing it from the very beginning and are engaged in a variety of ways, if only in the process of creating ghettos, for example. Jews have to abandon property, abandon the places where they live, and are then concentrated in some areas, usually very small and where the housing stock is of very low quality, etc., etc. So I should think. I mean, it's very hard to say it otherwise, but there is this broad interface of relationships, and just the general population is involved in a direct fashion in that process of persecution of Jews.
Yeah, you're saying it's a broad population. We can't single out any, right? We can't say, oh, it was the lower class people, oh, it was the peasants. It really was, the entire population was actively complicit. Yeah. Okay, so another audience member asks about reconciliation. I mean, how does Polish reconciliation for the role of Polish people in the killing of Jews compared to that of Germans? So how has Poland confronted its part compared to Germany's attempt to confront the past?
Well, one has to say first that it's the significance of involvement is very different. It's not the Holocaust. This is a Nazi project. This is something that's created and at a certain point by a regime that comes to power in Germany and that then carries war all around. And so in that sense, there is no comparison between the engagement of locals in some episodic acts of violence and this wholesale, very deliberate effort that emanates from Germany. Mm-hmm. And the German story of reconciliation, of course, is something that begins under compulsion, if you will. I mean, Germany gets occupied, loses the war, and there is a whole process of denazification that goes on at the very beginning. And there is frankly, a great resistance to it. So the process of confronting that past in Germany initially is quite awkward, and it proceeds very slowly. However, at a certain point, I would say in the 60s, when also it's a matter of confrontation between a new generation of Germans that was born, people who are born in during the war or after the war. I mean, 60s are very important. This is the whole revolution of the 60s. In part, has to do with confrontation of a young generation with the generation of their parents about what they had done during the war. Mm-hmm. And then it really becomes, I think, a very systematic and more thorough matter of public education somehow. And it's so the confrontation in Germany has been by now the awareness of responsibility of the horror that has taken place, the knowledge of what happened is, I would say, I live in Berlin now, so I can see it up close, much more thorough and if you wish, just a matter of fact. That anywhere in Eastern Europe, or perhaps even in Western Europe, it's a different story. We were talking about different numbers and different manners of engagement, but there was a very wonderful moment in Poland, and there is what I would like to stress: this tremendous historiography, and not only historiography, the production of cultural works, also whether artistic or reflections of humanists in other disciplines in history on this issue. So that has to do with the understanding that the implication, engagement, complicity in this process were just a matter that has not been neither addressed or fully researched so far, and it must be done. So on the level of scholarship, there are tremendous achievements, in Poland especially. But on the level of public education, not at all. And especially within the last few years, when this very xenophobic regime has come to power, one of its principal engagements is with a sort of historical revisionism about the Second World War, and promoting this narrative that the main form of and the most widespread attitude among non-Jewish Poles during the war was the attitude of if you will, of assistance and help being offered to the Jewish fellow citizens during the Second World War. This is, just read some Jewish testimonies from that period. A lot of them are available in print. You don't need to go to the archives. This is a blatant lie.
Yeah. So in Germany, it was a combination of denazification, public education, and kind of a new generation that queried its parents. And we just don't see that matched in Poland. We do see like scholarship and artists attempting to, but it's not reaching the level of public education, right? Because there's no government participation, is what it sounds like. So this was another audience question from Michael Schufler. So when bystanders or when perpetrators in Poland were queried, right, when they're on trial, how do they explain why they engaged in these killing sprees?
I've read a lot of transcripts of these trials, not only the ones that were pertinent to Jedwabne murder. These are trials had immediately after the war, and there is no great inquisitiveness, if you will, on the part of either those who conduct a preliminary investigation or judges, for that matter, in finding out the details. This, for instance, the trial in which there were some 1,500 or 1,600 victims. I'm talking about Jedwabne, in which there are 22 defendants. This trial lasts 2 days. So, it's really absurd from the point of view of legal discovery as to what goes on. And so my answer would be, we don't learn anything about motivations and about why people were doing it. What we're lucky if we find that actually there is enough testimony to say this has taken place and you or this and that person participated in it. And so.
Yeah, I lectured about the history of anti-Semitism last week, and I tried to explain, look, the murder of Jews happens because it benefits people politically, socially, economically. And students came back to me and said, but why are people so hateful and killing others? Well, I don't know if you would agree, like we have to just acknowledge that they benefit personally when they kill Jews because they get Jews' property.
Yeah. It's this is a very important way of thinking about it. It's coming back to a line that I have developed in the lecture about bystanders. It was such an important moment, and in some ways a kind of an opening for research. Later on, a British historian, Mary Folbrook, had coined other words, other terms that are much more direct and capture the engagement and the form of engagement of the surrounding population in the process of destruction. And she spoke of facilitators and beneficiaries. And I think but perhaps one needed a kind of a staged entry into this problematic, so to speak. And bystanders at the very beginning were a good key to open the door a little bit, and then our understanding developed. But let me say just one more word. Mm-hmm. These killings and complicity in killings that take place between neighbors is a phenomenon that does not limit itself, if you will, to the process of genocide of Jews during the Second World War. And in a recent history, we have seen on television, if you will, and very well documented, because by now the news travels fast, several episodes of these community killings that had many similar characteristics, in which just local people, general people, not some misfits or deviants or only those who are the most deprived materially participate. Think about Rwanda and killings between Tutsis and Hutus, or think about the war in Yugoslavia at the time when the communist regime collapses and Yugoslavia breaks up into several states, and the war that follows there. It's an extraordinarily cruel war in which neighbors are killing neighbors after so many decades of living together. So in that sense, it's some tragic element of human nature that we are predators in a way.
Yeah, I think that's very hard to come to terms with. Okay, another audience member, Patricia, asks, what was the response by governments in exile to these Holocaust by bullet events? So were they known at the time, and was there a response?
You know, the Holocaust by bullets, one didn't know the details at the time too much. Mm-hmm. Actually, the response of the government in exile was it addressed the issue. It spoke on occasion over a clandestine radio in broadcasts to the population in occupied Europe. It brought the attention. It brought the issue to the attention of the Allies, too, of the Allied governments. But again, it didn't measure up to the scale of what was going on. This was part of the activity, if you will, of the diplomatic activity of the government in exile, but it didn't. Yeah. The scale of what was going on and the scale of these efforts were just incomparable.
Yeah. So a student in the class asks, were there other victims that were killed in this way? Like, were the Roma and Gypsy also attacked in these kind of mass killing sites?
I think that assaults on Romas and Gypsies, at least I don't know of local episodes of violence carried out in that form. They were Gypsies and Romas were sent to concentration camps and then killed there within the camp itself in the process of these mass killings through gassing And I'm sure there were episodes of executions by bullets as well. But I really haven't come across evidence and scholarship on local populations' assaults on Romas in the way in which there had been these assaults, first of all in the form of pillage of Jewish property, and then also just episodes like the one, well, that one in Jedwabne is particularly radical.
Yeah. Okay, so one final question, and I want to take the question of our Ben Arroyo postdoctoral fellow, Smadar Ben Natan. She is a lawyer and also sociologist. So she says, you mentioned the reliance of historians on post-war trials as a source for testimonies. How do historians deal with the biases and interests which are imbued in testimonies by people who might have an interest either in their own or their fellows' fates, or in the historical narrative that the court would produce?
You know, it's of course this is a paramount question that we ask ourselves when we confront these testimonies, and there are many ways of dealing with it. One is just by reading a lot of these testimonies and trying to figure out what makes sense, so to speak, as as material that can be then brought into a just general discussion of what happened. It's individual testimonies about these matters. There is a, and it's written, it's documented. There is a sense on the part of witnesses who record what's going on, that they are in some way helpless vis-a-vis that reality, that this is a reality that goes beyond their own experience from before or imagination, and that they are only rendering a small part of what goes on, you know? And it's just also, you see this very vivid commitment and sense of obligation to leave a trace. The sense is people will not believe it, you know, and there is no temptation to embellish, if I may use the word, or to kind of skew this matter, because it's just so overwhelming that if you shed light on just one small little episode, you feel, okay, I've done something. So I don't see agendas really being played out there, you know, that would skew and give us a sense that we're dealing with bias in that sense. People are helpless, and of course they don't see very much that's going on. But in a way, there is a certain kind of innocence that goes into the preparation of these stories. And as to trials, in Eastern Europe, in any case, this is a period of imposition of communist rule, and of course trials are notorious for political bias. But with respect to documenting, if you will, or reporting on the involvement of the local population and complicity in persecution of the Jews, there is really no political agenda that would give us a sense that it may distort and lead, as it were, the production of evidence, because in trials, of course, there is people respond to questions. And again, in fact, these are quite perfunctory trials. just as I said, 2 days, literally, in a trial of 22 people accused of participating in the murder of 1,600. This is, you don't distort anything, you just don't discover almost anything. But this little thing that you discover is already very powerful.
I'm sorry, one more question. What was the outcome of the trial?
Half of these guys got sentences. One was sentenced to death, and half were set free. I mean, I'm talking about the Jedwabne trial. But trials in general, a lot of people get sentenced to some to some sentences, but then they are released after a few years, and then the change comes with destalization in '56, and a lot of people who got sentenced are just set free.
Wow. Okay, you have given us a lot to think about, and we have a lot of reflection to do. Thank you so much for joining us so early in the morning from Berlin. And thank you to all the audience members who joined us for this discussion. I hope you continue to join us in this series. So don't forget to come back next week for Nicholas Barr's talk on racism, anti-Semitism, and the lines of solidarity. I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of themes that tie across our lectures, and I look forward to putting them together with you. We will now end the webinar, and a YouTube link will be sent to you soon. Thank you and have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.